toss in the back room, and in our debate, Ken Buck was the winner. So he got to make a selection, and
the winner of the coin toss, not the debate.
That is correct. The coin toss. And as a result of that coin toss, Mr. Buck has chosen to go first in the opening comments. So, Ken, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank Club 20 for sponsoring this, and the other sponsors and the panelists for participating in this. I also want to thank my wife, Perry, who is here with me and is my main supporter as we've gone through this campaign. It feels very comfortable being to your right, by the way, Michael. Thank you. I want to, 18 months ago I started a grassroots campaign to earn everyone's support to be the next United States Senator here in Colorado. I have been to farms and factories, truck stops and coffee shops, listened and learned. And I have heard the frustration of countless Coloradans. They are concerned that they're concerned about jobs, they're concerned about the economy, they're concerned about putting food on the table and paying their mortgage. America has $13 trillion of national debt, $100 trillion of unfunded liabilities, a $1.4 trillion annual deficit. It is so bad that the folks in Washington, D.C. haven't even attempted to pass a budget this year. And what do? We continue to overspend, overtax, and overregulate. I was in Fountain, Colorado this week and this past Saturday, and someone yelled out from the crowd, "Ken, we need jobs." We do need jobs, but we aren't going to get more jobs if we continue to overtax, overspend, and overregulate. The choice in this election is very clear. My opponent has become very comfortable with the Washington, D.C. climate. He is saying one thing in Washington, D.C. Monday through Friday when he votes to increase our taxes and increase spending. And he says a quite different thing in Colorado. In fact, he is preaching fiscal conservatism to us on Sunday when he's back here. He has voted for the $862 billion stimulus bill. He has voted to bail out automobile companies and banks. He has voted to nationalize health care. And yet when he comes back here and runs for office, he has said, well, we have $13 trillion of debt and nothing to show for it. And it's immoral to place this debt on our children. And he's right, but he should have realized that when he voted for the $862 billion bill. We deserve more from our senator, and that's why I'm running for this office. We deserve to make sure that D.C. doesn't pick winners and losers. The consumers in the marketplace pick winners and losers, not Washington, D.C. Colorado families have to balance their budgets. The state of Colorado has to balance its budget. The federal government should have a constitutional balanced budget amendment so that it is required to balance its budget. My opponent has mentioned on a number of occasions that D.C. is a corrupt environment. It is broken. I invite him to join me in calling for constitutional term limits so we don't leave people in that corrupt environment for too long and they become corrupt. And the last thing, we need to focus on jobs. We need to focus our attention on giving small businesses the opportunity to create jobs and stop putting obstacles in their way. Folks, there is a very clear difference between a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. And I hope to earn your support to be the next United States Senator from Colorado.
Well, thank you very much for having me back in Mason County. Again, it's wonderful to be here the 12th time in 20 months. I want to thank Club 20 and Reeves Brown for having me back. I deeply appreciate it. And I want to thank all of you for hanging in there late into the evening. I was thinking a lot today about 9/11. 9/11 because the anniversary is today. It happened 9 years ago. Like all of you, like everyone across our state and across our country, I remember exactly where I was on a business trip in an airplane in midair when word came to the pilots that terrorists had attacked our country and killed thousands of Americans. And I remember going home because we came back and being with Susan and our 2 little girls at that time, the youngest of whom was about 8 months old, and holding her and watching over and over again those planes fly into the World Trade Center. And I remember thinking, and Susan's here tonight by the way, and I talked a lot about how the world had changed forever, and that the world that our children was going to grow up in was a different one than we had grown up in. And a lot has happened. We've lost over 5,000 Americans in 2 wars, 81 Coloradans over the last decade. And our economy has gone through one of the most troubling times in our nation's history. In fact, we are coming slowly out of the worst recession since the Great Depression. But even before we were driven into this recession, if you look at the last period of economic growth in our country's history and our state's history, what you will see is that it is the first time in our history that our economy grew, but middle-class income fell.
Yes.
That had never happened before in the history of the United States. In Colorado, by $1,000, while the cost of health insurance went up by 97%, the cost of higher education went up, I used to say, by 50%. It's actually 60%. At Mesa State, it was about 160%. We've created no net new jobs in this great country of ours since 1998, and household wealth is the same at the end of the decade as it was at the beginning of the decade. That's never happened before. When the last administration went to Washington, we led the world in the production of college graduates. Today we are 15th in the world and falling like a stone. And if you're a child living in poverty in our state, in a rural school district or an urban school district, your chances of graduating with a 4-year college degree are roughly 9 in 100. Your chances of being proficient at math in the 8th grade are roughly 15 in 100. And I'm being attacked by supporters of my opponent for having said what I believe is true. They must disagree. We have $13 trillion of debt on our balance sheet, and in my view, nothing to show for it. We haven't even had the dignity to maintain the assets that our parents and grandparents built for us. Our roads, our bridges, our wastewater systems, our sewer systems. Much less build the infrastructure we're going to need to compete in the 21st century. Transportation, transit, energy infrastructure. But what I have learned is that the aspirations that our families have, whether they're Republicans, Democrats, Independents, Tea Party people, are so much more common and important and shared than the divisive politics that are going on back in Washington, that I am so optimistic that not only this country can build a bright 21st century, but that Colorado will lead us there. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Senator. Again, as a result of an initial coin toss, we move into the next section of the debate with questions from our 4-member panel. The first question will come from Terry Binder, and the first question will be directed to Mr. Buck.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here tonight. I'm glad that you're there and I'm here. A viable transportation system is critical to both our national defense and our domestic economy. We've funded our transportation system with gas taxes for many years. However, we've never indexed these taxes for inflation, and we haven't raised them since the early 90s. Meanwhile, Congress has required vehicles to meet ever higher fuel efficiency standards, resulting in reduced gas tax revenue per driver, while the demands on our highways have continually increased. How do you propose we fund the maintenance and expansion of our nation's transportation infrastructure into the future?
There is no doubt we have declining revenue from our gas tax, and the answer is that we're going to have to supplement that to a certain extent with general fund money. I am opposed to raising taxes. I want to make that real clear. I think that when we look at raising taxes, we are going to do the exact opposite that we need to do in a recessionary period. Higher taxes means less jobs, a smaller economy, and we spiral downward. We cannot at this point in time increase our gas tax. And it is, in my view, a very regressive tax. It is a tax that is borne unequally by those that have less. And it is not something that I think is something that is going to...
Talk to us, Ken. Can't hear you.
Okay. It is regressive tax and it does not assist us in promoting wealth in this country. And so I am opposed to raising the gas tax.
Mr. Bennet?
Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, there is not just the unfunded liabilities that Ken talked about, which are substantial, but we also find ourselves in a place where we haven't maintained our infrastructure. I don't think there's any will in Congress to raise the gas tax, and I don't think it's the right time to do it for sure. I think we have to think about other ways of financing it because as the question points out, we're having more fuel-efficient cars on the road, which is a really good thing if you care about relieving us from our dependence on foreign oil, if you care about not shipping billions of dollars a week overseas, which we're doing right now with our current energy policy, to buy oil from people that turn around and give that money to fund terrorism against us. That's why those efficiency standards are so important. And I think what we have to do is find financing mechanisms, which we can do at the federal level, that enable public-private partnerships that can build the infrastructure we're going to need for the 21st century in a much more expeditious way than the bureaucrats in Washington could ever do.
Okay. Our second question will be asked by Clint Cresson, and Mr. Bennet will be the first respondent.
Gentlemen, we'd like to thank you both for your public service. I'll jump straight into my question. The healthcare safety net refers to healthcare providers that serve rural and underserved areas, Medicare and Medicaid patients, and uninsured. Rural health clinics are a vital part of that healthcare safety net in rural Colorado. But unlike federally qualified health centers, rural health clinics have been largely overlooked in the stimulus package and healthcare reform. What will you do to ensure that the rural health clinics remain viable and thrive as they serve the healthcare needs of rural Colorado?
Thank you for the question. I've worked very hard over the last 20 months to fight for rural health care in our state. It's been one of my priorities. I've spent a lot of time with people in rural health clinics who pointed out the problem that you're talking about. I think it's something that we need to address. We also need to make sure that we recognize that we have 425,000 veterans living in Colorado. It's one of the largest populations per capita veterans in the country, and a lot of them live in the rural parts of our state. And a lot of them are having a tough time getting access to health care because the VA isn't where they are. So I believe we need more rural health clinics in our state. We need to support the ones that we have, and there are roughly 1,000 that are being built across the country in rural America as a consequence of the health care reform bill that we passed.
If the question were as simple as building more clinics, we could all clap. The question is, where do we get the money when we have $13 trillion of debt? We have a fundamental problem with our healthcare system in this country, and it wasn't fixed by adding 16,500 IRS agents to the federal government, and it won't be fixed. It won't be fixed by enlarging Health and Human Services. I met yesterday, as I have in the past, with leaders in Grand Junction in their healthcare community. And it is clear to me that we need to get away from the fee-for-service model that we have now. We need to adopt a model that brings greater efficiencies and lowers costs and improves accessibility. It can be done in Grand Junction, but it's done in Grand Junction with a bottom-up model. It is not done with a top-down model. In fact, it's embarrassing that the federal government brought an antitrust action against Grand Junction because of their solution to the healthcare model. Grand Junction is actually operating under a consent decree now with, I think, the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission. But we need to empower local communities. We need to empower rural communities to figure out these answers. We do not need a one-size-fits-all answer from Washington, D.C.
We all need to speak more directly into our mics.
Thanks. I'm really glad you raised the great work that St. Mary's Hospital is doing, Ken, and also Rocky Mountain Health Plan. If people want to know what my vision is for what healthcare will look like in this country, it is what you see at St. Mary's and what you see at Rocky Mountain Health Plan. That's not a Bolshevik takeover of the United States of America. It's good work. Those Medicare incentive structures, it's hilarious to hear you talk about because it's exactly what we were trying to do in the bill. The ideas that I worked on, the amendments that I passed, were not original with me. They came straight from St. Mary's and Rocky Mountain Health Plans. I'm delighted with the chance to see it.
Our third question will be asked by Shane Henry, and the first respondent will be Mr. Buck.
Oh, I guess
Thank you.
It was his turn.
Since 1964, 43 wilderness areas have been designated in Colorado, totaling over 4 million acres. In 2009, President Obama signed legislation that established an additional 54 wilderness areas nationwide and added another 2 million acres to the current 109 million acres that are in the National Wilderness Preservation System. Congress is now talking about establishing more wilderness areas. What is your overall position on wilderness area designations, and what will your position be on Representative DeGette's wilderness proposal if it makes it to the Senate?
First, let me say, if you're wearing a blue t-shirt, please don't boo. Okay? Let's show respect to everybody here. In fact, if you're wearing a white t-shirt, please don't boo also.
I appreciate that so much, Ken, but I have to say, no one in a white t-shirt was booing.
Oh, that's terrible.
The folks that you brought from Denver to the Western Slope are much more polite, I guess. So.
You must not have followed. You must not have followed my campaign. Who's here from the Western Slope?
I can tell you, the Congresswoman from Denver, the former superintendent of schools from Denver, and the former district attorney from Denver should not be telling people in rural Colorado how to take care of their lands. We do not need President Obama designating wilderness. What we need in Colorado is a bottom-up solution where communities come together and decide on land use, not a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C., and that's exactly what's been happening. If we are going to limit access to our land in western Colorado, we need to make sure that the folks in western Colorado are on board with limiting that access.
Well, if I get this wrong, let me know, but my sense of it is, that, Ken, that you said that you would never vote for another inch of wilderness in Colorado, which I think would be a shame, because I think that it's one of the great legacies that we have in our state. But I agree with you that these decisions ought to be made in consultation with people in the local communities, as I have done, for example, with the legislation I've introduced to make Chimney Rock a national monument, something that's supported by the commissioners in that area, and something I'm very proud to be doing. So my view is that we ought to listen very closely to our local voices, knowing that there will often be competing visions locally about what the right way to go is, and that's okay. We need to be in places where we hear each other talk. That's why my favorite rooms during this campaign have been ones where there were Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated Tea Party folks, as I said earlier. We've stopped listening to each other, and we really need to start again, and on wilderness particularly.
It's an interesting position that you take, Senator, because there was a group of folks that got together, and they worked very hard on the Vermilion Basin issue. And what happened was that Governor Ritter and Interior Secretary Salazar pulled the rug out from under them after they had come up with a great plan, a plan that environmentalists and county commissioners and local leaders came together and adopted. And you said nothing. You said absolutely nothing when the political forces in Washington, D.C. and Denver pulled the rug out from under them on a plan that would have worked.
And the fourth question for the first round will come from Amy Walter. And Senator Bennet will be the first responder.
Thank you. I also like that you have matching outfits.
Thank you.
We don't have called each other beforehand. Or... All right.
I wear the same clothes every day.
Amy, you must not have looked at the footwear because there is a difference.
I can't see that from here. All right. So my question is about...
Do yours have a hole in it?
Okay. I didn't realize we were going to go that far with this. All right. So a question for both of you about independent voters. The fastest growing block of voters is the unaffiliated voter who doesn't believe either party has all the right answers. I want to ask you both to explain how you plan to attract those voters and give a specific example where you disagree with your party or party position.
I plan to attract them by having, as I have had, an honest conversation with them over the course of the last 20 months. I have not restricted myself to blue parts of the state. I've gone to red parts and blue parts. And I always say to people, bring any criticism, ask any question. You guys have heard me say that. I said I was an urban school superintendent for almost 4 years. You can't hurt my feelings. And I also ask people to forget just for the moment what cable television network they watch so that we can actually have a conversation. And as I said earlier, I think that our aspirations are largely shared. I think politicians in Washington spend all their time trying to divide people. I can tell you over 20 months that's not something that I've done. I'll give you a couple of examples on where I've disagreed with my party. I disagreed on an attempt by the Obama administration to change the tax treatment for depletion allowance and other natural gas, things that are important in our natural gas industry. And I voted against that, knowing that I would be tortured in my primary over it, which I was, and knowing that I might not win every vote on the western slope, which I may still not. But I thought it was the right vote for Colorado, which is the way I look at these questions. I also disagreed with the administration on the cancellation of the Orion project, which would have affected us here in Colorado. I have voted to cap discretionary spending over and over again. I have put a bill in that, called the Deficit Reduction Act of 2009 that I can tell you most people in my party don't like. So there are numerous examples. If we had more time, I'd like to give Mr. Buck.
I will attract independent voters the same way I have attracted Republican voters and the same way I hope to attract Democrat voters, and that is by running a grassroots campaign, going to every corner of this state, meeting with everyone in coffee shops and truck stops and all across the state. I will meet with them one-on-one, I will listen to their concerns, and I will express my views, even if I do have a Democrat tracker taking film of me that will later be used in a way that is deceitful, to say the least. How do I disagree with my party? I can tell you right now, I have said 500, 600 times that Republicans are every bit as much to blame for the mess that we are in as Democrats. We have had a system in place now. While the Republicans brought some responsibility to the Clinton years, they acted absolutely irresponsible in the Bush years, and we had deficit spending under Republicans, not quite the deficit spending on steroids that we have now, but it was still deficit spending. And we have no business saying to our Democratic friends, it's okay if we raid the Treasury for our friends, but it's not okay if you raid the Treasury for your friends. It's wrong, it's fundamentally wrong, and we need to change the culture in Washington, D.C. if we're going to get this country back on track.
Well, I don't don't need to rebut that, although I will say that I certainly don't agree that anything we've said has been misleading about what's been said by my opponent during his campaign. It's true. I mean, you know, he said I say one thing in Washington and another thing here. I'd love to discuss those examples because I certainly disagree with him. Ken doesn't need to leave the state to say one thing different in one place and another thing completely different in another place. You know, he beat Jane Norton by saying a whole bunch of things that were supported by Washington outside money, and now he's changing his tune. That's what politicians do.
And now we're going to go through the cycle of panels again. And Terry will ask her first question, and Mr. Buck will respond first.
Iran represents a major threat to peace and security in our world. They've made clear their intentions towards our ally Israel by threatening to wipe their country off the face of the earth. Iran aspires to get nuclear weapons and may be succeeding in gathering the necessary materials. If they do, the consequences for world peace and security are grim. What additional action, if any, should the U.S. take to deal with this very real threat?
We absolutely, positively cannot allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon, period, end of story. They do not have the capacity right now. What we need to do is we need to make sure that we step up economic sanctions. We cannot rely on the United Nations to be the lead in this area. We have to take the bull by the horns, and we have to make sure that we do. If, and only if, economic sanctions and other sanctions that we try to take do not work, then we need to look at a military option. And it is absolutely imperative. Iran will change the balance of power in the Middle East if it gets a nuclear weapon, and we have to have the strength to either support our ally Israel in taking military action or take military action ourselves. We have too much at stake. Now, why do we have too much at stake? We have too much at stake because we have created an energy dependence on the Middle East. There are many reasons beyond just our strong ally in the Middle East, Israel. But the fact remains that we cannot allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon.
Well, let me first start with, I largely agree with what Ken said. I'll start at the end and say, where he ended, and say, I find it disgraceful that we have an energy policy in this country that requires us to ship billions of dollars a week to the Persian Gulf to buy oil, as I said earlier, instead of creating jobs here in the United States. It has tortured our foreign policy, and I can't think of a better legacy we could leave our children than breaking that reliance on foreign oil. And as long as I'm there working for you, I'm going to be working to do that. We cannot let Iran get a nuclear weapon for build a nuclear weapon for the reasons that Ken said. I have been pleased to have the chance to vote for sanctions legislation that it passed the Senate as law that came out of one of the committees that I'm on. But we need to make sure those sanctions are implemented strongly, wisely as well, by not just the United States, but the Chinese and other people around the world that we need to worry about, so we can shut off the ability of Iran, among other things, to refine its petroleum and build new refineries. And I would not take any option off the table, including a military option, to stop Iran from building a nuclear weapon.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Buck.
Senator, how can you talk about having energy independence and support cap and trade at the same time? It makes no sense to me. We have the capacity to produce a lot more coal in the state of Colorado, create a lot more jobs in the state of Colorado, and clean coal technology is on the horizon. And we should be pursuing that, and it will be retarded by a cap and trade bill.
The second question will be asked by Clint, and the first respondent will be Senator Bennet.
USDA Rural Development has identified several pillars as focal points for rural America: food systems, economic development, energy development and transmission, and broadband access. How specifically would you work to help USDA Rural Development and other federal, state, and local organizations develop and enhance rural communities' capacities in these areas?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate the breadth of the question, because rural communities in our state are suffering much greater hardship even than our urban communities going through this incredible recession. And it's not just about opening markets for our crops and livestock, but that's a huge piece of it. It's not just about getting credit flowing again to our farmers and ranchers, but that's a huge piece of it. It's about the food systems that you talk about, broadly speaking, economic development and energy development and transmission, all of that. And I've worked especially hard to try to get broadband access to our rural communities so that, among other things, our small businesses in rural Colorado can compete with any business across the world, and that our children going to schools in rural Colorado have the benefit of a world-class education. I was in Julesburg, Colorado, and saw a math class being taught to children in their school, actually young adults, it was a high school, in their school, but also in 4 other counties at the same time. There was a math class, a higher level math than I had ever seen in the school district I used to work in, which had 75,000 children. There is huge promise here if we can build out broadband across our state.
I live in rural Colorado. Weld County has more jackalopes than people. And we are in desperate need of economic development. Economic development is really the basis to build the education system, the health system, and other areas. My wife worked for Governor Owens in the economic development area in rural Colorado. We need to make sure that we are encouraging farmers to diversify the crops that they grow. There have been so many examples of farmers who have grown corn for generations on their farms and have diversified into sunflowers and other areas and have found markets for products that have increased their profitability and have developed. But one of the problems that we have in this state is much of our economic development focus is along the Front Range. And we need to find ways to encourage businesses to move to more rural areas so that those areas can stay afloat. We have so many, especially on the Eastern Plains, so many communities that are literally dying. Their populations are decreasing at a rapid rate, and we can't allow that to happen in our great state. The diversity in this state between our urban centers, our suburban areas, and our rural areas makes this state great, and we need to make sure that we continue to help assist our rural areas.
The only thing I just want to clear up one piece of the record. A few minutes ago, Ken said, well, why would you support cap and trade? I didn't support the cap and trade bill that passed the House, and I do think it's an unproductive conversation to be fighting about cap and trade or carbon tax or cap and do. What we should be talking about is how do we break our reliance on foreign oil? How do we create jobs in the United States? And how do we burn cleaner energy and conserve energy that we have? And you know what? Rural Colorado would benefit a lot if we focused on the question of how to produce energy in the United States, natural gas, biofuels, wind, and solar.
Thank you. The next question will be asked by Shane Henry, and Mr. Buck will be the first respondent.
Thank you. This will be a nice segue to your comments there. The United States does not have a strategic national energy plan in place. As a result, specific legislative attempts to regulate or create new rules of the game, climate change, carbon emissions reductions, hydraulic fracturing legislation, and others are seen as reactionary and industry targeted. What do you believe should be the cornerstones of a national energy plan, and how would you balance renewable energy with the development of domestic fossil fuel resources as part of this plan?
Oh, I'm sorry. Is this for me?
No, it's Mr. Buck.
Oh,
Ken
sorry.
first.
I am in favor of an all-above energy plan. We obviously have to look at renewables, we have to look at green energy, but we have abundant fossil fuels in this state. We have abundant coal, natural gas, and oil. We are finding new oil fields regularly. We found one a few months ago in Weld County. We have to take advantage of what we've got and put people to work developing energy. We cannot let the federal government, based on unproven science, try to stop our need to develop energy in this state. We have clean coal technology, as I said before. That my understanding is that it is 5 or 6 years away from being much more environmentally friendly than it is now. We have resources, natural gas resources that will power the western United States for a century if we were allowed to develop those and build the pipelines that we need to get that natural gas to market. We have to focus on an all of the above energy policy. We cannot allow the federal government to pick winners and losers in the energy sector. We cannot allow the state government to do the same. It's wrong, and it is inefficient.
Well, I really appreciate the way you phrased the question, because the part about our seen as reactionary and industry target, I think is completely fair. And I think that's been a huge problem with the energy debate that has been had in Washington. I've tried very hard not to contribute to those problems and continue to focus our attention on what is the nature of the problem we're trying to solve, which, by the way, is exactly the opposite of what folks in Washington do. They don't diagnose the problem and then say, let's figure out the solution. They find a solution that some lobbyist brings them from either side and says, here's the solution to a problem that may or may not exist. You know what? No one here that runs a business does it that way. No one here that runs a nonprofit or a hospital or anything else does it that way. And my whole career has been outside of politics until I was in this job. And I never approached my work that way. So it's a question of perspective so that you don't end up in a place doing nothing, which is what we're doing right now. It'd be a mistake to imagine that winners and losers aren't being picked right now. Big oil, major oil companies have a real interest in making sure that we don't get to the natural gas in our state. I can assure you of that. Because otherwise, 18-wheelers all across this country would be running on natural gas today, which is actually cheaper for that purpose than imported oil is. So I look forward to working with everybody across our state to make sure we're driving this new energy economy.
Yeah, let's make sure, Senator, that when we are working with everybody, we make sure that we aren't driving higher costs in this state. And that's exactly what we're going to get with the type of environmental legislation that you have supported in the past and that your party has supported and that the folks in D.C. are trying to ram down our throats. We are an energy-rich state. And we need to maintain those jobs. We need to maintain our focus on energy and energy development. Clean, environmentally friendly energy development.
And our final question for this part of the debate will be asked by Amy Nelson.
Okay, my question is about the Bush tax cuts that are set to expire at the end of this year. And my question for both of you, do you support extending the tax cuts, including those affecting individuals making more than $200,000 a year or families making $250,000 a year? And I would also like you to explain how your position is the most fiscally prudent decision.
My main concern here is to make sure that we extend the middle-class tax cuts that were part of the Bush tax cuts. You know, let's remember, and I think Ken Buck said this very well, both Republicans and Democrats are to blame for the mess that we're in today. Because if you look at those tax cuts, they're the first tax cuts in our history. It was the first time in our history that we cut taxes while we were fighting a war. In this case, 2 wars, which is how we ended up going from $5 trillion in debt to a little over $10 trillion in debt. In this savage economy, my main interest is extending middle-class tax cuts. I would be open, if there is a compromise, to work with the other party to see whether we can do something on the ones for people at a higher income as well, temporarily, because they're not paid for. And cutting taxes from the very wealthiest Americans, borrowing the Chinese to pay for it, and sticking our kids with the bill is not what I would call fiscal responsibility. We have to deal with these issues. We have to deal with these issues. And by the way, as they expire ultimately, I'm very interested in looking at, and I've got suggestions I've already made, about how we cut taxes on small business and on people that are actually creating jobs in the United States so that we can create an economy that's not just about consumer spending, it's not just about debt, but it's about investment and savings and growing jobs here in the United States. Our tax policy should drive that.
Mr. Buck?
I think what we're debating here has nothing to do with President Bush and has nothing to do with tax cuts. It has to do with whether the government is entitled to your money or whether you're entitled to your money. My view is you're entitled to your money. And instead of Senator Bennet talking about the tax cuts, maybe he can tell us where families should be cutting to make up for the increase in taxes that they'll have to pay. The simple economic fact is, as we increase taxes, we decrease jobs. And we are in a recession right now, and we don't want to decrease jobs. The folks that make over $200,000 are often the folks that hire the folks making under $200,000. If we increase taxes on those folks, they're going to hire less, and we're not going to get out of this recession, and we're not going to improve the unemployment situation. I'll tell you exactly why I think it's a fiscally prudent decision to maintain this tax structure that we have now. We need to cut spending. That's where we balance the budget. We don't balance the budget on the backs of American citizens who are paying higher taxes. We cut spending and balance the budget.
Senator? Well, first of all, Bush isn't relevant to this either. I agree. It's just that you're advocating the same policies that led us here, which is what makes it relevant. On top of that, to advocate or to support or to propose, you will figure out the verb, you figure out the verb, of a new federal national sales tax, as you have done, which would dramatically raise taxes on middle-class people and working people over the country, is a huge mistake. And furthermore, what we are not entitled to is to leave our children with a $13 trillion debt. And you can say we're going to cut all these taxes, we're going to do all this stuff, but we're not entitled to do it. Because you know what, my daughter says she's not paying.
Now we're going into the cross-exam portion of our debate. And again, based on the coin toss earlier today, Senator Bennet will be in charge of the first 4-minute section. Are you guys clear on how this operates?
We'll figure it out. Ken, I think that, as I've said, that the economy ought to be job one, and we do need to deal with our deficits and our debt. I've suggested that we provide estate tax relief for small business owners, farmers, and ranchers by raising the exemption to $5 million for singles and $10 million for couples, and make it more affordable for people who have conservation easements to hand down their land to their families. Jump-starting lending to small business by allowing a longer period of amortization for loans from community banks, making it easier to meet capital requirements, spurring incentives, spurring innovation with tax incentives for high-tech research by reauthorizing the expired research tax credit, investing in small business in rural communities. On the other hand, you have, yes?
I want to remind you this is a question and answer.
Okay. Thank you. On the other hand, you said that the best plan, let's see, quote, the best plan I saw to try to balance the budget is Paul Ryan's plan. Problem is, according to nonpartisan budget experts, that plan would mean higher taxes for 75% of Americans and huge tax cuts to the very wealthiest, eliminate Medicare and Social Security, eliminate all corporate income taxes, and add trillions to our national debt.
Senator, a question?
Well, here's my question. So what Ken has said is that he's got a plan that suggests we can balance the budget through some spending cuts. Do you know what would occur? It's not going to balance until 2063. That's unacceptable. So my question to you is, what more would you do than is proposed in Paul Ryan's plan to balance this budget?
I'll tell you, first of all, what I said was that I respected Paul Ryan for putting something on the table. There are too many people back in Washington, D.C. that won't answer simple questions like where they are on card check, for example. It is easy to criticize an individual like Paul Ryan for putting something on the table. And as I have said a number of times, I don't agree with many of the proposals in his plan. But even his plan doesn't balance this budget and doesn't get us out of this debt until 2063. And I agree with you, that is acceptable. It is unacceptable, and my daughter, like yours, will not pay a dime of this debt. And our goal should be that our kids don't end up paying a dime of this debt. I think what we do, if we're going to get out of this situation, is we have to grow our economy. We have got to strive for energy independence, so we stop the largest transfer of wealth in this country's history, in the world's history, frankly, from this country to oil-producing countries. We lower the corporate tax rate so that we can compete in international markets and we can bring manufacturing jobs back to this country. We stop over-regulating with EPA regulations that are unrelated to good science, and we do what we need to do to grow this economy so that we have a larger tax base and we can get out of the mess that we are in, frankly. Not a mess that you caused, not a mess that I caused, other than your last 18 months. Not a mess that either one of you caused.
I think you're right to begin with. I certainly didn't cause this mess. And neither did you, Ken. I just want us to get out of it. And words do matter. I mean, what you said was, quote, the best plan I saw to try to balance the budget is Paul Ryan's plan, which is fine. It's just not going to work. And we can talk about, growing ourselves out. I'm all for that. Tax cuts, I'm all for that. But the reality is, as we sit here, folks, $13 trillion in debt on the balance sheet, 17% of our operating budget is non-defense discretionary spending. 18% is defense spending, 65% is Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on our debt. We need to be having a serious conversation.
Mr. Buck, you need to control the next 4 minutes.
Here we go.
I can't follow.
Senator, your commercial that you have run against me, the best estimates that I've heard is that you've spent, you and the DSCC have spent about $1 million in that commercial. The Channel 4, Channel 7, and Channel 9 fact checks have said that commercial is misleading, it is false, it is deceitful. The Denver Post this morning, in their lead editorial, said that it was misleading and fundamentally unfair. One part of the ad is a complete falsehood. My question to you is, will you agree, based on independent analysis, will you agree to take that ad down?
I think I won't. I stand by the ad, and I think that the Denver Post didn't know which Ken Buckner was fact-checking. I saw that editorial this morning. I read it, and here are the things that we've said. Department of Education. Question. This was at Burlington Community College on January 10th.
Well, let me follow up. Let me follow up, Senator. No, you've answered the question. You're not going to take it down. That was the question. Now let me follow up. The question now is everybody else wrong and you're right? Is Channel 4 wrong, Channel 7 wrong, Channel 9 wrong, the Denver Post wrong, but you're right?
They're mistaken.
They are mistaken.
It's an honest mistake.
Everybody's mistaken but you.
Well, let me just read that. Question. You mentioned education. Would you be in favor of abolishing the Department of Education at the federal level? Ken Buck, quote, and these folks too. I'm getting you folks here, Ken. I would be in favor. That was Burlington Community College. Student loans. Buck said, quote, this was at a Teller County Tea Party event, February 6th. 2010. There are some programs within education that we can get rid of tomorrow. By the way, I believe that too. There are other programs that are going to have to take some time to get rid of, like student loan.
You just have introduced a rule to try to stop filibustering, so let's stop it right now. I'm a senator, I will help with that bill also.
You asked me if my ad was
No, I didn't. I asked if you would take it down. You said no. Right. That's the answer to the question.
Right.
Now, I have a few more questions if I have. How much time do I have left? Minute and a half, good. And this is a true false. You can answer yes, no. Is it true that you specifically gave $1.5 million in an earmark to an airport named after Congressman John Murtha from Pennsylvania that serves fewer than 20 people per day?
I'm sure it's true that that was contained in legislation that I voted on. It was certainly not of interest to me. $1.5 million, I think, is
is of interest to all of us, frankly.
No. I'm sorry, I thought you were trying to suggest that I was doing it because it had something to do with John Murphy, so I misunderstood what you said. It's the reason why I've advocated earmark reform since I've been there. I have never supported an earmark for a private institution. I'm the only senator in the United States Senate that lists not only the earmarks that I request, but the earmarks that are requested of our office. But more important than that, it's all about transparency, whether it's being done, whether it's being done in the Congress or whether it's being done in administration, people are spending all kinds of money that they're not focused on.
Let me get the last word. I just want to make a promise to you. I will not use your misstatement in a commercial, okay?
Will you promise that Carl Rope and all those guys that are funding all your ads won't use it?
So now move into the closing comments. And again, based on the coin toss earlier, Senator Bennet will go first. You have 3 minutes.
Thanks. Thank you. Well, that's 1 minute more than I thought that I would have, so I won't use it all. Let me just say thank you to all of you for hanging in there so late tonight. It really has been an incredible privilege to travel 25,000 miles of this state in the last 20 months, to listen, to hear people. I don't give long speeches, but I encourage debate, I encourage discussion, I encourage people to bring their criticism and their ideas. And what I've learned is what everybody in this room knows, which is that we all essentially want the same thing. And by the time this stuff gets to Washington, it's so screwed up by the special interests, so screwed up by the lobbyists. By the way, it's an interesting idea on the lifetime term limits for senators and congressmen, and I might be willing to think about that when we have a lifetime ban for lobbyists. I think that would be a really good thing. Term limits for lobbyists. But what we need to do is have confidence in each other, no matter what party we belong to, no matter what part of the state we live in. And we need to have confidence that all of us want to build a bright 21st century in Colorado and across this country, create the most competitive economy in the world, leave our children unconstrained by our unwillingness to make tough choices. And as long as we go back to our basic values, we're going to be just fine. I said at the beginning in my opening that when we saw that television set that night on 9/11, that Susan and I knew the world had changed forever for our kids. But what we also knew was that the values of this country would endure, no matter what we faced. The values of this country that allowed my mother and her parents, who survived the Holocaust in Warsaw, Poland, to come to this country and start over again. The values that allowed them to build a small business, to educate their daughter, to help provide for their grandchildren. Those are the values that we need to be focused on. Generations of Americans have faced even longer odds than the odds that we face. And they have managed to overcome challenges that in their time seemed impossible to solve. We can do the same thing if we stop screaming at each other. We're willing to listen. If we focus on the facts and gain a shared understanding of the facts, I absolutely believe this country's best days are ahead of us. So thanks for being here tonight. Ken Buck, thank you for being here tonight. And Club 20, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Club 20. Thank you, panelists and Mr. Moderator. It is a great honor to be here. I hope the contrast is evident at this point, folks. We have done our best to run a grassroots campaign with integrity, not denying what the rest of the world sees. And we have done our best to make sure that we have told those folks in Washington, D.C., Senator Bennet and his friends, when they run up $1 trillion of debt, we protested. When they tried to pass a nationalized health care bill, we sent them emails. when we wanted to help with unemployment, we asked them to get off the backs of small business. When we saw the problems with illegal immigration, we asked Republicans and Democrats to secure our border. And the funny thing is, they heard us, but they ignored us. And on November 2nd, folks, they will ignore us no more. We have a great opportunity with this election to give voice to those Americans who have not given up on this country's experiment in limited self-government, who do not believe that America's decline is inevitable. We need to return to the liberating principles of our founding fathers. As it was for most of this country's history, it can be again. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to take an oath right here and right now. I will take an oath that I will not swear allegiance to the Republican Party in Washington, D.C. And I will not swear allegiance to the lobbyists in Washington, D.C. When I'm sworn in January, maybe November, if the senator agrees to step down, I will put my left hand on the Bible, I will raise my right hand, and I will take an oath to the Constitution of the United States, so help me. In this election, we have a choice. We can repeat history, or we can make history. My name is Ken Buck. I ask for your support so that we can make the kind of history that our children and our grandchildren will be proud of. Thank you, and God bless you.
That concludes this debate. I want to thank the candidates and the panelists for all their questions, and thanks to all of you for coming out. Good.
Thank you to everybody for sticking out here so late. Let's do one final round of applause for all the candidates, panelists, and moderators. If anyone wants some yard signs relating to opposing Amendments 60, 61, and 101, they're sitting at the front desk for the taking. Thank you for tonight. That concludes the debate.
Hey, Mike, how are you?